Hello and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson, as usual. This is a continuation of last week's video, so you might want to watch that one first. In that video we examined one of the most famous preludes from Book 1 of Debussy's Preludes, and now we're moving on to a more obscure piece from the second book of Preludes, written 2 or 3 years later. By the time Debussy wrote the second book of Preludes, he had progressed still further along the experimental territory that he opened up in the first book. And these preludes are both more abstract and also highly mysterious in construction. There's much less of the kind of sentimental, romantic style that was still prominent in the first book, although it's by no means gone. The Debussy of The Girl with the Flaxen Hair and Clair de Lune never entirely went away throughout his career, no matter how strange and marvelous his more experimental works became. This prelude is an even more striking experiment with free form than the Sunken Cathedral. Now there's no trace left of any standard form, whether that would be ternary or anything else. There's a kind of an arch structure, but everything about the way the melodic material is structured and the harmony progresses is entirely directional. So we start in one place and we travel to another through many detours and windings. There's no real symmetry in the normal classical sense. Even when ideas repeat, there's no such thing as an exact repetition. Always things are somehow a little bit changed and altered and developed. This is also signified in a way by the opening. We start on the most unstable of harmonies. This is something that would have been impossible for any kind of common practice classical construction. The piece starts on a diminished seventh chord. And although we have a key signature of 6 sharps, which ostensibly should mean F sharp major, we don't reach a stable arrival on F sharp until the very end of the work. In fact, F sharp is never heard as a bass note at all until the very second to last page. There is, however, a recurring suggestion of what we would call the dominant of F sharp in a tonal piece, so C sharp. That happens at the beginning and through the piece, on and off, but it isn't treated like a typical dominant harmony. Instead of using it to create tension with F sharp, Debussy sets up a strange juxtaposition between the G dominant 7th chord and the F sharp C sharp harmony. So this G7 chord, from which the opening kind of scale coming down is constructed, never resolves to C major as it would in tonal practice. It just hangs unresolved whenever it appears, which, by the way, of course, is Debussy's favorite way of handling the dominant 7th chord. It almost seems like Debussy took a particular kind of pleasure in treating this chord, the dominant 7th, which had so many associations built up by this time about how it should resolve and how it should be treated in relation to the tonic. He had just this kind of glee in treating it in a totally different way. Usually it would have to resolve, right? But Debussy almost never does that in his mature style. Anyway, this juxtaposition of the G dominant 7th against C sharp, F sharp becomes a kind of icon of the piece, and it seeps into all elements of the music and is brilliantly encapsulated in the final bars of the piece. I think even more strongly than in the Sunken Cathedral, last week's piece, we can see here how Debussy organically develops melodic ideas, how they seem to grow and take shape until the final bars. This kind of pliable, free approach to form, this gradual discovery and opening up of an idea, was one of Debussy's great contributions to musical form. Even composers who claimed to dislike his music, like the American Charles Ives, for example, was quite outspoken about his dislike of Debussy, use this technique constantly in their music, and you can see it everywhere in composers after Debussy up to the present day. Probably Debussy got the idea for this type of compositional technique from 2 places, probably partly from the transformation of themes that Liszt was so well known for, as well as the way in which different leitmotifs in a Wagner opera will combine together over the course of the work to create a new set piece later on in the drama. This is most prominent in the Ring cycle, for example. So in the Ring cycle, a whole set of motives comes together in the last opera to form a popular set piece known as Siegfried's Funeral March. And it has all these smaller themes that began course earlier in the operas and when they're all brought together, it creates an entirely new set of associations and an entirely new musical structure. So that's probably the root of it, but this way of letting a small motivic cell kind of blossom into a full idea in the course of the work, and the way that it's affected and altered by the contrasting material that also appears, is really unique to Debussy, and I can't think of anywhere where you see it so purely as in many of these preludes. As I think I mentioned last week, this kind of approach was another part of Debussy's resistance to what he saw as the hegemony of the Germanic tradition in composition at that time. So if you went back to the classics like Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, they all made use of motivic cells to construct larger works, but they did so in a much more clear-cut, explicit kind of manner, in a very logical, argument kind of based way. It's more like an orator trying to convince his audience. In Debussy's case, it's more like a storyteller, just gradually drawing us in with his approach. The closest kin that Debussy had in the kind of Austrian-German, Viennese school would have been probably Franz Schubert, in whose music the demands of instinct are given freer rein than they were in any other composer up to that time, with the possible exception of someone like C.P.E. Bach, perhaps. And I think that that is part of the key. Debussy allows the inspiration of the moment, the feeling of improvisation, to play an important role in the formation of his structures. In that way, he's even a forerunner to the aleatoric movements of later decades. And Debussy's influence, it has to be said, was absolutely enormous and very important. And for a long time, this wasn't really understood. I think Debussy was kind of marginalized as being kind of just a light salon composer. His music wasn't very substantial and so forth. And perhaps this was partly because of the many copycats of his style which sprang up. But they generally only succeeded in imitating the surface atmosphere without reaching the deeper qualities in the construction of the music that made it so unique and powerful. As a side note, this prelude also has a highly enigmatic aftertitle. I call it an aftertitle. All the preludes, of course, have titles, but they're not at the top of the work. They are placed at the end as kind of like little afterthoughts, as ways to see the image or story of the piece. Anyway, the title for this piece, Le Terrasse des Audiences de clair de lune, I've seen it translated many different ways. Literally, it would be the terrace of the moonlight audiences. I've also seen it realized as the terrace where moonlight holds court, which is a little bit more vivid, although that does infer some things that are not actually spelled out literally in the original. The original French is appropriately somewhat vague. I think Debussy did this on purpose. Unfortunately, my knowledge of the French language is still very limited. I'm trying to learn to speak it, but I'm not quite there yet. So if there are any native speakers out there or people with a deep knowledge and understanding of the grammar of the French language, please do comment if you have any ideas about possible interpretations of this title and what it could possibly represent in your mind. I'd be very interested to have your thoughts on that. So anyway, please like and comment, subscribe, enjoy the performance, and check back next week for more great music.